Ghetto trash, Crockett. The words cracked through the Senate chamber like a gunshot. In that instant, every camera locked in, every microphone leaned closer. Across the polished oak desks, J.D. Vance sat with the smirk of a man who believed the insult would stick forever. What he didn't know was that, in the next 5 minutes, Jasmine Crockett would turn his career into a cautionary tale. Racially coded language isn't new. It's a weapon that's been fired in America for over 200 years. But here's the shock. Studies show it can sway public perception in under 90 seconds. And in politics, that's enough to bury a reputation or crown a new hero. That afternoon, the nation would watch one of the most calculated political takedowns in recent history, delivered not with shouting, but with precision. And it all began with those 3 words. They landed like a thrown brick, hard, ugly, and meant to leave a mark. The Senate chamber went still, the way a city freezes a second before the sirens start. Every camera pivoted toward the source, zooming in on J.D. Vance's face, his lips curved with that practiced half smile, the one meant to look casual but sharpened just enough to cut. Reporters stopped mid-sentence. One veteran correspondent, 20 years in the building, would later admit she had never heard language like that on the record. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett sat utterly motionless. Her hands rested lightly on the desk, nails trimmed, blazer pressed to a razor's edge. Her eyes didn't flicker. Not toward the chair, not toward the cameras, certainly not toward Vance. It wasn't the frozen stillness of shock. It was the stillness of calculation. She knew the rules here. Whoever lost control first lost the room. And Vance's insult had been designed for exactly that, to pull her off balance, to paint her anger as proof of his caricature. But she didn't bite. Not yet. The air between them thickened, every breath a weight. In the gallery, an aide clutched a stack of papers a little too tight, the edges curled under her fingers. A pearl necklace twisted round and round beneath the nervous touch of Senator Eliza Snow. Someone in the press row whispered, "Is she going to answer him?" But the words fell flat, because everyone could see. Crockett wasn't waiting to respond. She was making the silence itself into her reply. And it worked. Vance shifted in his seat, only slightly, but enough for the cameras to catch the adjustment. The smirk didn't fade, but the muscles around it tightened, the way a boxer's stance changes when he realizes his opponent didn't go down after the first hit. This was no longer routine Senate business. This was a duel, one fought under fluorescent lights in the gaze of millions. Crockett finally leaned back an inch, slow and deliberate, as though granting herself the space to breathe. Her chin lifted, not in defiance, but in quiet alignment with the storm she was about to unleash. The insult still hung in the room, like smoke that wouldn't clear. But in her stillness, she had already taken it apart, piece by piece, until it was nothing more than the opening line of a story that was about to turn against the man who spoke it. The lights above bled a pale, unforgiving glow over the polished oak desks, turning every scratch in the wood into a scar. The kind of light that doesn't flatter. It exposes. J.D. Vance leaned back into his chair like a man who had already counted the votes, already planned his victory interview. One arm rested lazily along the armrest, the other tapping a slow rhythm against a yellow legal pad. His lips curled, not into a smile exactly, but into that quiet, smug bend that says, "I know how this ends, and it ends my way." Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat as still as carved stone. The only movement, the faint rise and fall of her chest, the soft exhale that steamed briefly in the cool air before vanishing. Her eyes were level, flat as the surface of a lake before a thunderstorm. If there was heat in her, it was buried deep, banked embers under layers of control. The air in the chamber had shifted, not just silence, but density, like a room that had been sealed shut for years. Aides exchanged glances that lasted a fraction too long. Reporters gripped their pens tighter, the scratch of ink against paper sounding louder than it should. In the gallery, Senator Eliza Snow adjusted her pearl necklace for the 3rd time in as many minutes. It wasn't vanity. It was the kind of nervous habit people fall into when they feel a quake under their feet but can't yet see the cracks. From somewhere in the back, the faint click of a camera shutter punctured the air. The photographer didn't dare take another, afraid the sound itself might tip the balance of whatever was about to happen. because everyone knew something was coming. They could feel it in their bones, the way you feel a storm before you hear the first rumble. But no one knew from which direction it would strike. Vance kept his posture loose, but his gaze was sharp, locked on Jasmine like a marksman keeping his sight on a target. If this were a chess match, he'd just made an opening move designed to provoke, to bait. And now he was waiting, patiently, smugly, for her to step into his trap. But she didn't move. The tension crawled higher, invisible but heavy, wrapping itself around the room's marble pillars like ivy tightening its grip. Somewhere in the press row, a junior reporter swallowed hard, the sound embarrassingly loud in the stillness. Her editor, seated beside her, shot her a quick look, a silent, steady yourself. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. It didn't even blink. She wasn't meeting Vance's stare as an equal. She was meeting it like someone already standing where he thought he was headed. And the difference between the two was razor thin, but in a room like this, it could draw blood. Vance shifted his hand from the legal pad to the manila folder in front of him. A single red tab stuck out like a warning light. It read, Crockett, background strike. He didn't open it. Not yet. He just let his fingertips rest there, as if the weight of that paper was enough to remind her, and everyone watching, that he had something loaded. The stillness thickened. It pressed into the skin. It made you acutely aware of the sound of your own breathing. And then, Jasmine leaned forward, just slightly. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't a challenge. It was more like the shift of a sailor reading the wind before turning the wheel. The move was so small, most viewers at home wouldn't even notice it. But in the chamber, it was seismic. An aide on the Republican bench stopped typing mid-sentence. A Democratic staffer crossed his arms over his chest, eyes narrowing as though he'd just seen the first sign of a counterattack. Vance noticed it too, and for the first time the smirk faltered. Not much, but enough for the cameras to catch. Jasmine let the moment stretch, her eyes never leaving the space between them. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of rushing. She was going to make him feel the weight. Outside, in living rooms and diners across the country, viewers didn't know they were holding their breath. Inside, every second of silence felt like a coin dropped into a jar, stacking the tension higher, heavier. Somewhere far from the chamber, history teachers would one day play this footage for their students. Not for the insult, but for the pause that followed it. Because here was the thing. Power loves speed. It wants the insult to spark an immediate flame, to burn up fast and leave only smoke. But Jasmine Crockett was in no hurry to burn. She was the match still in the box, waiting for the exact moment when striking it would set the whole room alight. Vance, leaning back again, tried to reassert the casual dominance he'd entered with. He tapped his pen once, twice, the sound loud in the microphone. But tapping can't hide the faint tightening in the jaw, the subtle roll of the shoulders, the flicker in the eyes when a man realizes the target isn't falling into place. And somewhere in that flicker, Jasmine found her opening. It didn't come yet. It didn't have to. The beauty of a pressure cooker is that you don't hear the explosion until the lid is ready to fly. And in that chamber, beneath the marble, under the glare of the lights that made every flaw visible, the heat was rising. Every person in that room knew it. The question was, who would feel it burst first? It wasn't J.D. Vance. Not yet. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett moved. Finally. But not in the way anyone expected. No slammed fist. No voice raised. No jagged interruption that could be spliced into an evening news headline. Instead, she reached, slowly, deliberately, toward the leather binder at her right. Her fingertips brushed over its edge like a pianist testing the first key. Vance's gaze flicked to it, then back to her face. The faintest crease appeared at the bridge of his nose, as if he were trying to decide whether this was the counterstrike he'd been waiting for, or something else entirely. The room watched her hand disappear into the binder's pocket. The air seemed to thicken around that single motion. When her arm emerged, she held a thin stack of papers, no more than 5, clipped neatly together. On top, in bold red ink, one word, voided. She didn't wave it like a banner. She didn't even lift it high enough for the back row to see. She simply laid it on the desk between them. The sound it made, soft paper meeting wood, was barely audible, but somehow it hit harder than a gavel strike. Vance's eyes narrowed. His pen stopped tapping. It was the smallest of gestures, but it carried an unspoken message. I've come prepared. And now, Senator, you will play on my field. No one in the chamber moved. A photographer at the far end shifted his weight but didn't dare press the shutter. Even the C-SPAN feed seemed to pause, lingering on the two of them as if waiting for the next line in a play neither had rehearsed. Vance tilted his head, just slightly, the way a man does when he's trying to read the fine print of a threat. The smirk that had been glued to his mouth all morning faltered, its edges softening under the weight of uncertainty. Jasmine, on the other hand, was unreadable. Her posture didn't change. Her breathing didn't quicken. Her eyes stayed forward, locked not on Vance's face but on the space between them, as if the desk itself was the true battlefield. The word voided sat there like a scarlet warning. In the gallery, Congressman Malik Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes narrowing with recognition. He knew what that word meant. So did anyone who'd ever seen legislation stripped bare and left useless before it could take root. To the untrained eye, it was just paperwork. To those who understood the game, it was a loaded weapon, one that didn't need to be fired to make its point. Vance cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but in the silence it landed like a hammer drop. "What is that?" he asked, voice pitched low, almost casual. Jasmine didn't look at him, didn't answer. She simply turned the top page ever so slightly, enough for the red stamp to catch the light. The cameras drank it in. Social media interns in newsrooms across the country clipped the moment in real time, their captions already forming. Crockett lays trap in plain sight. Vance shifted again, but this time the movement lacked its earlier confidence. He glanced at the red tab sticking out of his own folder, the one labeled Crockett, background strike. And for the first time it seemed to burn in his peripheral vision. Jasmine finally spoke, her voice low but clear enough to cut through the room. "Some things," she said, "look one way on paper, until the truth stamps them out." Her tone wasn't fiery, it was surgical, the kind of calm that slices cleaner than rage ever could. Vance said nothing. He couldn't, not without asking the question she wanted him to ask, and he wasn't ready to hand her that win. But the silence wasn't his ally anymore. It belonged to her. Every second he let it stretch, the trap tightened. In the second row of the gallery, a junior clerk glanced at her watch and realized only 30 seconds had passed since the paper touched the desk. It felt like 5 minutes. Crockett's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the stack, not gripping it, just there. Like a chess player's hand hovering near a queen, she knows she'll move soon, but not yet. Her stillness was no longer the stillness of defense. It was the stillness of possession. She had the floor, even if she hadn't been officially recognized to speak. And Vance knew it. His pen tapped once against his folder, then stopped. His jaw worked in the subtle grind of a man swallowing down words that might taste like surrender. The word voided stayed visible between them, its red ink almost glowing under the lights. Somewhere beyond the cameras, beyond the marble walls, millions of viewers watched with the same unblinking focus. They didn't know what was in those pages. They didn't need to, because the weight of the gesture told them everything. This wasn't a detour in the hearing, it was a turn in the road. And whether J.D. Vance realized it or not, the path forward was no longer his to choose. Jasmine Crockett moved again, not abruptly, just enough to draw every eye in the chamber back to her. Her left hand slid into the inner pocket of her blazer. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, almost reverent. For a moment, no one could tell what she was reaching for. Not the aides, not the senators, not even Vance, whose gaze instinctively followed her hand like prey tracking a predator's paw. When she drew it out, it wasn't a sheet of policy notes. It wasn't an affidavit or a court document. It was a photograph, small, faded at the edges. The kind of photo that lives in wallets, not frames. Jasmine held it with both hands. Not high, not low, just where the light caught it. The image was simple. A little girl, no more than 7, standing barefoot in front of a crumbling brick house in South Dallas. The porch sagged in the middle, boards curling at the edges like dried leaves. A single shutter hung crooked beside a window covered in plastic. But it wasn't the house that caught the breath of the room. It was the girl's stance, fists clenched at her sides. chin lifted just enough to defy the camera. Eyes steady, unblinking, like she already knew life wouldn't play fair, and she'd have to play anyway. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The photograph spoke in a language older than politics. It told of nights where the wind came through the walls, of mornings where breakfast was a question, not a guarantee, of walking past people who looked right through you. The chamber went still, not the polite stillness of attention, but the held breath stillness that happens when truth steps into the room uninvited. In the gallery, a young staffer's pen slipped from her fingers and rolled onto the floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Senator Eliza Snow's hand froze mid-twist of her necklace. Even the court reporter, trained to transcribe every syllable without pause, glanced up from her machine. Vance's eyes found the photograph, and for a split second, the armor cracked. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a flicker of recognition. Not for the place, not for the girl, for the defiance. Jasmine lowered her gaze to the picture, letting the moment breathe. Then with the same careful precision, she set it down on the desk between them. No flourish, no pointed glance, just a quiet placing, like setting down evidence in a trial the jury already understands. The photograph lay there, its corners slightly curled, the image glowing faintly under the overhead lights. Vance didn't reach for it, didn't even lean closer, but his gaze kept sliding back to it as if it were pulling at him in ways he didn't want to admit. For viewers at home, the image hit like a hammer. It didn't need a caption. It didn't need context. It was poverty, unvarnished, untheorized, staring back at a room built to pretend it didn't exist. Jasmine's voice, when it finally came, was soft enough to force the microphones closer. "This house," she said, "may not look like yours, Senator." She let the words settle, not to provoke, but to let them find their weight. It didn't look like mine forever either, but it raised someone strong enough to sit across from you. There was no edge in her tone, no sharpness to carve him open. That would have been too easy. Instead, it was the calm of someone holding a truth so personal, so undeniable, that to challenge it would make the challenger look small. Vance's jaw tightened. His pen rested unused beside the untouched legal pad. Jasmine didn't look at him again. Her eyes stayed on the photograph, as if it were the only witness she needed. The silence that followed was different from the one earlier in the hearing. This wasn't tension waiting to snap. It was something heavier, an acknowledgement, even among those who wouldn't say it out loud, that the ground beneath this conversation had shifted. In homes across the country, people saw themselves, or someone they loved, in that barefoot girl. They remembered the houses that leaned with age, the smell of rain finding its way through the roof, the way you learned to stand tall even when the world seemed built to make you small. And in that moment, the photograph wasn't just Jasmine Crockett's. It belonged to anyone who had ever fought their way into a room where they were told they didn't belong. The chamber didn't exhale until Jasmine leaned back again, her hands folding loosely in her lap. The picture stayed on the desk, untouched. Between them, it was no longer just paper and ink. It was a mirror, and the man across from her was being forced to look. Jasmine let the weight of the photograph linger for another breath. Then quietly, without warning, her right hand drifted to the leather binder again. This time, she didn't reach for loose papers. She drew out a book. Its cover was familiar to millions. Dark blue background, serif gold title, Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance's memoir. The book that had built his public identity. The book that turned him from an obscure lawyer into a household name. She placed it on the desk in front of her, aligning it neatly with the edge, like evidence being entered into the record. Vance's eyes snapped to it, and just for a moment, there was the faintest hitch in his breathing, caught by the lapel mic broadcast into homes across the country. Jasmine's fingers rested on the cover, not possessively, not timidly, just there, like she was holding the pulse of the conversation in her palm. "You wrote this, Senator," she said evenly, her tone not accusing, but factual. Vance gave the smallest nod, the kind of acknowledgement meant to look like control. Jasmine opened the book. Her thumb brushed over a cluster of fluorescent yellow tabs marking specific pages. The first one flipped open with a dry rustle. She didn't look at him. Her eyes scanned the text as if reacquainting herself with an old memory. Then she began to read. My mother struggled with addiction. I saw things a child shouldn't see, but I learned to carry my pain like a badge, proof that I'd earned my place. Her voice was steady, deliberate. Every word came out crisp enough to cut. Vance's smirk did not return. His eyes narrowed, but not in focus. More like a man trying to anticipate the destination of a road he suddenly realized he didn't choose. Jasmine turned the page. She didn't rush. Each flip was another second of oxygen leaving his side of the room. She read again. You can take the boy out of the holler, but you can't take the holler out of the boy. She closed the book halfway, her hand still marking the page. Then she looked up, directly at him. Struggle, she said softly, is not a costume. The words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They fell into the chamber with the weight of a verdict. A ripple went through the gallery. Not gasps, not whispers, but that subtle shift in posture when people realize the fight just changed hands. Vance's fingers curled slightly against his pen. Not tapping now, just still. Jasmine set the book down flat on the desk between them. It's not something you put on when you want to look relatable, she continued, her tone still measured. It's not something you hang in your closet when it no longer fits your story. Her eyes stayed locked on him. No glance to the cameras. No check for the reaction in the gallery. This wasn't performance. It was cross-examination. Vance shifted in his seat. Only a little, but the microphones caught the faint creak of leather under his weight. The image of the barefoot girl from the photograph lingered in the air like smoke. Now, with his own words laid beside it, the contrast was unavoidable. One was survival, the other, marketing. Jasmine slid the book forward just an inch. In these pages, and she said, you told America that your pain made you who you are, that you understood the weight of growing up without safety, without certainty. Her tone sharpened, not with volume, but with precision. And yet, here you are, using that story not to open the door for others, but to slam it shut. The sentence hung there, long enough for everyone in the room to hear the absence of any rebuttal. Vance didn't reach for the book, didn't even put a hand on the desk. His gaze dropped, just for a moment, before snapping back up. It was a flicker, but the cameras caught it. The kind of moment political consultants spend weeks trying to prevent. Jasmine leaned back, folding her hands in her lap again. The book remained between them, its title facing outward toward the cameras. It was no longer a memoir. It was Exhibit A. Outside the chamber, in living rooms, diners, and break rooms, viewers recognized the turn. They knew what it meant when someone's own story was turned against them. It wasn't just political damage, it was personal exposure. And as the red light on the cameras glowed, that exposure was being broadcast into every corner of the country. The silence that followed was almost reverent. Not for Vance, for the fact that something fragile and uncomfortable had been placed on the table, and no one dared move until they knew what would happen next. Jasmine's voice came one last time, lower now, but no softer. If pain is the currency you trade on, Senator, she said, then at least be honest about who paid the price. She didn't wait for him to answer. Her gaze dropped to the book for half a second, then back to him. Steady, unflinching. Between them, the memoir lay like a broken mask, and J.D. Vance, for all his practiced composure, was starting to look like a man who could feel the air inside it running out. The pause in the room was dense enough to hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Every eye was on him, until a chair scraped from the third row of the gallery. The sound was unhurried, deliberate. A man rose. Tall, sharp suit in charcoal gray, silver tie knotted with the precision of someone who understands the visual weight of a moment. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses caught the light as he stepped forward. The chair he'd left behind rocked once, then stilled. J.D. Vance turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing. He recognized the face. The committee chair's gavel tapped once. Not to call for order, but to acknowledge. Dr. Anthony Bledsoe, she said, her voice carrying just enough respect to sharpen the tension. The name rippled through the gallery like a signal. Bledsoe, professor of political linguistics at Georgetown, author of The Language of Power, How Words Build Empires and Break Nations, a man who had testified in front of more committees than most senators had ever chaired. He didn't take the witness podium immediately. Instead, he stopped beside his row, scanning the room like a man measuring the temperature before he lights the match. "I wasn't scheduled to speak today," Bledsoe began, voice steady but warm. "However, I believe what we've just witnessed requires context." The chair gave a slight nod. "Proceed." Bledsoe's eyes shifted to Vance, not with hostility, but with the precision of a surgeon marking an incision point. "The phrase you used earlier, Senator," he said, "is a textbook example of what we call coded racism." A murmur rolled through the room. Bledsoe let it fade before continuing. "It functions by avoiding explicit racial terms," and he explained, "but relies on centuries-old associations to signal the same prejudice. In this case, ghetto trash, the connotation is deliberately loaded." He adjusted his glasses. "To the casual ear, it's just an insult. To the trained ear, it's a dog whistle. It implies race, class, and criminality in one breath, without ever naming them outright." Vance's jaw flexed. His pen turned once between his fingers. He didn't interrupt. Not yet. Bledsoe went on, his tone almost professorial, but edged with something firmer. "These phrases are designed to humiliate without crossing legal or procedural lines. That's why they persist. They can be defended as just words while doing the cultural work of exclusion." He shifted his gaze briefly to the photograph still on the desk. "In rhetoric, context is everything. That image," he gestured toward the little girl before the crumbling house, "is real context. Your words, Senator, are a frame meant to distort it." The silence deepened. Even the court reporter had slowed her keystrokes, unwilling to miss a syllable. Bledsoe's voice dropped, each word measured. "This is not accidental language. It is not casual. It is, by design, a tactic, one as old as the structures that built this chamber." Vance finally leaned forward, voice low. "With respect, Professor, I think you're overanalyzing a passing remark." Bledsoe didn't flinch. "That," he said, "is the second function of coded speech. It hides in the shadow of its own denial. You can claim it was nothing, and those inclined to believe you will. But for those who've lived under the weight of those words, there is nothing accidental about them." A faint stir came from the Democratic bench. Malik Thomas nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Bledsoe turned back to the chair. "Madam Chair, I offer this analysis not as opinion, but as documentation. We have decades of linguistic data showing how such terms map onto racialized thinking and policy bias. Language like this is not free-floating. It has consequences." He let the last word hang, then glanced at Vance again. "Whether or not you intended them, Senator, you invoked them. And in this room, intention does not erase impact." The effect was surgical, not shouted, not dramatized, just placed with the precision of a scalpel. Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved since he began speaking. She didn't need to. Her silence now was different from before. Less a shield, more an acknowledgement of the weight someone else had just placed on the table. Vance shifted in his chair, shoulders angling away from the desk, as though he might create space between himself and the words now echoing in the chamber. The cameras caught it. So did the audience. Bledsoe stepped back, giving a brief nod to the chair before returning to his seat. The motion was simple, but the air he left behind felt denser, charged. The photograph still lay between Jasmine and Vance. Beside it, the memoir. And now, layered over both, the professor's dissection, a linguistic autopsy on the insult that had started it all. Vance stared at the desk for a beat too long. In a chamber where seconds stretch into history, that pause was enough to read as retreat. And though no gavel struck, no formal decision was announced, everyone in the room knew. A new piece had just been added to Jasmine's arsenal. One Vance couldn't discredit without discrediting himself. Jasmine didn't rush to use it. She let the weight of Bledsoe's words settle, watching as they threaded themselves into the minds of everyone present. Then she glanced, just briefly, at the clerk seated beside her. It was the smallest nod, barely perceptible, but it was enough. A moment later, the chamber lights dimmed, the pale glare softening into something heavier, more deliberate. Behind the senators, a projection screen began to lower from its hidden recess in the wall, the sound of the mechanism faint but undeniable. Vance turned his head toward it, suspicion flickering across his face. The screen glowed to life, Grainy footage appeared, archival, the kind that carries the faint static of a decade gone by. The image, a younger J.D. Vance, suit too big for his frame, standing on the courthouse steps in Cincinnati. No podium, no campaign banner. Just him speaking into a small cluster of microphones with the hollow weariness of a man explaining defeat. "I over-leveraged," his voice said from the speakers. "The properties failed. I'm filing Chapter 7 today." The words fell into the chamber with a dull thud. No one moved. On the screen, the footage cut to slow pans of foreclosure notices tacked to doors, unpaid tax slips, empty homes with plywood for windows. Another clip. Vance again, this time in a 2011 local TV interview, saying, "I was lucky to have a system that let me rebuild. That's what makes this country great." The lights from the screen flickered across his face in real time, illuminating every twitch of his jaw, every blink he couldn't quite time away from the cameras. Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She looked at him. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried in a way that made the room lean toward her. "Why," she asked, "is that grace not extended to people who look like me?" The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop a few degrees. Even the air conditioners, humming faintly in the background, felt muted. Vance's gaze shifted back to the footage, then to the desk, anywhere but at her. She let the silence stretch. 5 seconds. 7. Not to gloat, but to let the question find its mark. Across the aisle, Malik Thomas's expression hardened, his arms folding slowly across his chest. Senator Eliza Snow's fingers stilled against her pearls. It wasn't just a political question anymore. It was moral. It was personal. Jasmine leaned forward, elbows on the desk, her tone still calm but edged with something unmistakable. "You failed, Senator, and the system called you resilient. We fail, and the system calls us dangerous." Her words weren't coded in rhetoric. They were surgical, slicing the space between them into before and after. The screen behind her continued to play the B-roll, vacant lots, court clerks stamping documents, a mailbox stuffed with unopened bills. She didn't need to narrate it. Everyone in the room could read the subtext. "You got to rebuild," she said quietly. "You got to stand here today because someone, somewhere, decided you were worth a second chance." Vance's knuckles whitened around the pen he still hadn't used. The camera zoomed in, capturing the subtle tremor in his right hand. "And yet," Jasmine continued, "when it's a single mother from South Dallas, a returning citizen trying to find work, or a kid caught up in a system stacked against him, you don't just deny the second chance. You vote to make sure they never even see it." Her gaze never left him. The footage slowed to a freeze frame of the younger Vance, eyes downcast, shoulders slightly hunched. The visual hung there, a ghost of his own making. In homes across the country, viewers were seeing it, his past, his present, and the gap between them. Some saw hypocrisy, others saw the universal truth. The myth of the self-made man often has scaffolding the audience is never meant to see. Jasmine leaned back now, not retreating, but settling into the authority she had just claimed. "This isn't about failure," she said. "It's about who this country lets get back up." The sentence landed with a thud you could almost hear. No one rushed to fill the space. In that moment, J.D. Vance was no longer the man asking the questions. He was the man being asked, and there was nowhere to hide from the answer. The lights slowly returned to full brightness, the projection screen rolling back into its place above the chamber. But the image of that younger man on the courthouse steps lingered in everyone's mind. It was no longer just part of his story, it was evidence. And Jasmine Crockett had just turned it into Exhibit B. She let the silence hold for a breath. Then, without looking away from J.D. Vance, she reached for a slim black folder at the far edge of her desk. It was smaller than the others, no thick stacks of policy printouts, no graphs or charts. Just a single envelope inside, its edges worn soft from being opened and closed too many times. Jasmine slid it out, placed it gently on the desk, and unfolded the crease with a care that told the room this wasn't politics. It was personal. "This," she said, her voice measured, "is from a woman named Leandell." She didn't raise her eyes to the gallery. She kept them locked on Vance. "She's a single mother, or she was, Until your policy made sure she wouldn't be for long. The weight in her voice wasn't rage. It was something colder, sharper. Jasmine glanced down at the page. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind of script that speaks of effort spent on being heard. Then she began to read. Senator Vance, you don't know me, but you've made decisions that have decided my life. The chamber quieted even more. It wasn't the respectful silence of order. It was the kind of stillness that comes when everyone knows they're about to hear something they can't unhear. I was working 2 part-time jobs. I was also in community college. I didn't have much, but I was keeping the lights on and my daughter fed. Jasmine's voice didn't tremble. She wasn't telling her story. She was letting Leandell tell it. Then the state flagged me as at risk under your bill because I missed a mandatory training day. That day was my custody hearing. I had to choose between the court and the training. I chose the court. The state chose to take my child. Someone in the gallery shifted, the movement loud in the stillness. Jasmine continued, each word deliberate. You called it accountability. You said people like me had a poverty mindset. I call it punishment for trying to survive. Her eyes flicked up just long enough to meet Vance's. He didn't look away, but his jaw was locked so tight the tendons stood out at his neck. I showed up in that courtroom alone. I wore a blazer from Goodwill. I had a binder full of proof that I was doing everything I could. But it didn't matter, because you had already written my story for me, and no one cared to read the truth. The sound of pen on paper had stopped entirely. Reporters were no longer taking notes. They were watching. Now I see my daughter once a month. She's 7. She asks why I can't be there for school plays, for bedtime stories. I tell her I'm trying. She asks why the judge didn't believe me. I don't know how to answer without saying your name. Jasmine's voice didn't harden, but it cooled, like water running over stone. If my voice shakes, it's not weakness. It's the echo of every woman you've silenced with laws like yours. She lowered the page. The letter was finished, but the air wasn't ready to move. The words sat in the chamber like smoke after a fire, heavy, clinging, inescapable. Jasmine folded the letter with the same care she'd opened it. She set it down between them, just to the right of the photograph and the memoir. 3 artifacts now, 3 pieces of truth, each one impossible to dismiss without pulling apart his own credibility. Her name, Jasmine said quietly, isn't in your book. Her life isn't in your speeches. But her reality is the cost of the policies you call success. Vance's hand twitched near his pen. Not to write, just a reflex, as if reaching for something to hold on to. In the gallery, Senator Eliza Snow lowered her gaze to her lap. A junior aide beside her blinked rapidly, pretending to check a phone that hadn't buzzed. Jasmine leaned back slightly. She didn't look triumphant. She looked resolved. This hearing, she said, is about judicial reform. But make no mistake, what we're really deciding here is whose failures get forgiven and whose lives get erased. The cameras caught every syllable. Vance's face stayed still, but the stillness now looked brittle, like glass under too much pressure. Jasmine's eyes lingered on him for a heartbeat longer. Then she turned her attention back to the committee chair. I submit Leandell's letter into the record, she said simply. No one objected. The gavel didn't strike. It didn't have to, because the real judgment wasn't in the paperwork. It was already written on the faces in the room. Jasmine let that moment sit. Not long, just enough for the silence to calcify. Then she reached for another folder. This one was different. Black leather, no label, edges sharp like it had been kept separate for a reason. Her fingers slid under the clasp, flipping it open in one clean motion. Inside, a neat stack of printed emails, headers intact, logos crisp, timestamps and subject lines in bold. She lifted the top page with 2 fingers and held it up, not to the gallery, not to the cameras, but to the man sitting across from her. January 2019, she said evenly. From Peter Thiel, subject line, Ohio Senate Prep. Vance's brows drew in, just slightly. Recognition or fear flickered for the briefest moment. Jasmine's eyes dropped to the highlighted line halfway down the page. She read it aloud. Build him up. He looks like poor America, but votes like the rich. We can sell him as one of them. He'll never vote like one of them. A ripple moved through the room. It wasn't noise. It was the sound of people trying not to react too obviously. Vance didn't blink, didn't lean forward, but his pen tapped once against the desk, a reflexive twitch that the microphones picked up like a drumbeat. Jasmine laid the first page flat on the desk, then another, and another. Subject lines spilled into the air like accusations. Packaging the Vance brand. Wardrobe strategy, flannel index, swing county messaging. She didn't need to explain. The phrasing spoke for itself. One email included bullet points. Avoid sounding too elite in small-town interviews. Keep speeches to self-made narrative. Avoid mentioning donors. Emphasize overcoming adversity, but no details that make him seem unstable. Another memo was blunter. His real value is optics. His vote record will stay aligned with our interests. Jasmine's voice stayed calm, but her delivery had the weight of a gavel coming down on each line. You weren't lifted by your struggle, Senator. You were lifted because you could sell someone else's story. The words landed heavy, not shouted, not dramatized, just stated as fact. And facts are harder to dodge. Vance's jaw tightened. His gaze stayed fixed on the desk, but the cameras caught the way his hand flattened against the folder in front of him, as if to steady himself. From the gallery, Malik Thomas leaned forward, expression unreadable but eyes locked on Vance. An aide in the second row shifted in her seat, lips pressing into a thin line. Jasmine set down the final page. These aren't rumors, she said. These are your emails, your team's words. The blueprint for the persona you've been selling to the public. She gestured to the stack. This is the scaffolding behind your so-called bootstrap story. Without it, there's no campaign. Without it, there's no Senate seat. The chamber was silent except for the faint hiss of the ventilation. Vance finally spoke, his tone low but clipped. I don't control how supporters talk about me. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't even blink. You controlled whether you played along, she replied. And you didn't just play, you made sure the script stayed intact. The silence that followed was surgical, a pause designed to force him into the trap of answering again, or leaving the words hanging in the air to be replayed on every news cycle. He chose not to answer. Jasmine didn't press. She didn't need to. The emails on the desk were louder than anything she could say next. Across America, viewers weren't just seeing the takedown. They were seeing the strings, the machinery behind the man. And once you see the strings, you can't unsee them. The self-made narrative was no longer a source of pride. It was Exhibit C. Jasmine sat back, hands folding loosely in her lap. The photograph, the memoir, the letter. And now, the donor files. 4 strikes, each different, each precise. Vance shifted in his chair again, but this time it looked less like strategy and more like discomfort. The cameras caught it. So did the people in the room. For the first time in the hearing, J.D. Vance didn't look like a man steering the conversation. He looked like a man trying to survive it. Jasmine let him sit in that discomfort for a heartbeat. 2. Then, with no change in expression, she gave a small gesture toward the AV technician at the side of the chamber. The lights dimmed again. The projection screen descended for the second time. No title card this time. Just the sudden flicker of an old home video. The image was shaky, handheld. The frame opened on a woman in a hospital bed, her hair damp against the pillow, an oxygen tube resting gently under her nose. She looked tired, exhausted, but her eyes were bright with something unguarded. The woman was Bev Vance, J.D.'s mother. Her voice came through the speakers, faint but clear enough to cut through the stillness. I want to thank Dr. Rivers, she said, her accent soft but certain. He saved my life. I wouldn't be here without him. The camera panned slightly, catching a glimpse of the doctor beside her, a tall, middle-aged black man in scrubs, smiling modestly, his hands folded in front of him. He didn't treat me like I wasn't worth the trouble, Bev continued, her voice breaking just enough to make the words land heavier. He listened. He cared. He didn't have to, but he did. And that's the reason I'm here talking to you. The footage froze on the image of Dr. Rivers at her bedside. The lights stayed low. Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She looked straight at J.D. Vance. "Funny," she said quietly, "how that part didn't make it into your book." The sentence was clean. No sarcasm, no raised volume, but it cut the air like glass. Vance's mouth pressed into a line. He didn't glance at the screen, didn't move at all. The silence was different now, not the tense waiting of earlier, but the stunned kind that follows a hit no one saw coming. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly on the table, her voice soft enough to force the microphones to carry it. "You told America your life was built on grit, that you made it because you pulled yourself up. But even your mother's life, her life, was saved by a man who would be on the receiving end of the very rhetoric you use today." Her eyes didn't waver. Not once. On the screen, the frozen image of Dr. Rivers stayed sharp, his expression calm, kind, unassuming. "You erased him," Jasmine continued. "You erased him from your story because he didn't fit the version you wanted to sell. Because including him would mean admitting that sometimes the people you paint as outsiders are the very ones who keep us alive." Vance's pen was still in his hand, but it wasn't tapping anymore. It was motionless, gripped tight enough to make his knuckles pale. Jasmine gestured subtly to the AV tech. The footage began to roll again, this time without her speaking over it. Bev's voice filled the room once more. "He told me, 'You're worth saving.' I don't think anyone had ever said that to me before." The video ended abruptly. The lights rose slowly, almost reluctantly. But the image, the doctor's face, Bev's words, stayed hanging in the air like a ghost. Jasmine leaned back now, her tone calm but edged with something unshakable. "You built a career on telling America you owed no one. The truth is, you owe him, and maybe you don't want to say it, but we all just heard it." In the gallery, someone exhaled audibly, as if they'd been holding their breath since the first frame. Vance finally looked at the screen. Empty now, but only for the briefest second before his gaze dropped back to the desk. The cameras caught everything. The hesitation, the refusal to answer, the tightening of his jaw. It was the kind of visual that lives forever in replay clips. Jasmine didn't push for a response. She didn't need one. The point wasn't to make him speak. It was to make the country see. The photograph, the memoir, the letter, the donor files, and now the doctor. Each piece was a crack in the facade, and with every one, the wall of his carefully built narrative leaned just a little further toward collapse. The gavel struck once, not to adjourn, but to call a recess. The sound echoed off the marble walls, but another sound rose beneath it. A murmur at first, then a chant. It began as a low, steady pulse from somewhere beyond the chamber doors. By the time the senators began to stand, it had grown into something sharper, louder, alive. Jasmine gathered her folders with the same calm she'd carried all morning, but her head tilted slightly toward the sound, as if she could already tell what it was. The double doors at the far end swung open. Light from the hallway spilled in, along with the noise. "This is our mic now! This is our mic now!" The chant was raw, unpolished, but it carried the kind of rhythm that makes a heartbeat match it. Security moved instinctively toward the doorway, but the chair's hand went up. "Don't." Jasmine stepped down from her seat, not hurriedly, but with a deliberate pace that made people part without being told to. The hallway was already packed. Students in hoodies and backpacks, their faces flushed with adrenaline. Men and women in work boots, still streaked with the dust of their shifts, and threading through them, the sharp outlines of dark suits and polished shoes, professionals who had stepped out of offices to be here. Phones were raised, cameras blinked red. Every lens seemed to tilt toward her the moment she appeared. But she didn't raise her hands. She didn't take the center. She stepped into the crowd, not in front of it, but into it. She was shoulder to shoulder with a young woman holding a cardboard sign scrawled in thick black marker. "Grace for all, or grace for none." The chant shifted. It wasn't just noise now. It was harmony and chaos. Someone passed a megaphone forward, not to her, but to a man in a worn leather jacket, his voice already hoarse from shouting. "They tell us to wait our turn," he bellowed into it. "They tell us to pull harder, work harder, be better, but they keep the ladder pulled up behind them." A roar went up. The sound rolled down the corridor like thunder. Jasmine didn't speak. She looked at the faces around her. The nervous ones, the defiant ones, the tear-streaked ones. She saw a boy no older than 20 gripping a union flyer like it was a passport. An older woman in pearls standing beside him, nodding along as if the rhythm of the chant had reached her bones. "This is our mic now. This is our mic now." The marble columns along the hallway seemed to throw the sound back at itself, doubling it. Inside the chamber, reporters had drifted to the doorway, their cameras catching the sight of the senator walking out. Not into a press gaggle, but into a storm of ordinary people. Someone tapped her shoulder, a man in a press suit, tie loosened, eyes tired but intent. "You're why they showed up," he said quietly. "Don't let them tell you different." She shook her head. "They showed up for themselves. I'm just here so they know someone's listening." Another wave of the chant hit. "This is our mic now." And then, suddenly, it wasn't just voices. It was hands. Hands clapping in time. Hands raised above heads, palms open, like they were offering something invisible to anyone who would take it. A student near the front lifted her phone toward Jasmine, the live stream icon glowing red. The comments on the screen scrolled so fast they blurred, messages from every corner of the country. Jasmine didn't take the phone. She just leaned slightly into the shot so the people watching would see exactly where she was. Not on the dais, not behind a podium, in the crowd. And the crowd, sensing it, shifted closer around her. No pushing, no frenzy, just the quiet, physical acknowledgement of solidarity. The sound outside was different from the chamber's tight surgical precision. It was messy. It was alive. It was uncontainable. And in the back of the hallway, far enough to think they weren't seen, a pair of Vance's aides watched. One had a phone pressed to his ear, the other scrolling furiously through social media feeds that were already running clips of the hearing, spliced with the hallway revolt. It wasn't policy now. It wasn't votes. It was momentum, and it was moving away from him. Jasmine didn't stay long enough to turn it into a spectacle. After a few more minutes, she stepped back through the double doors, letting the sound follow her in like a tide. The marble walls caught the last echo before it faded. The air inside the chamber was different now. It wasn't just quieter, it felt heavier, as if the chants from outside had seeped into the stone itself and refused to leave. Every senator was back in their seat. Some leaned forward, elbows resting on desks. Others sat straighter, pens stilled in their hands. The aides and staffers, for once, weren't moving. Jasmine walked the aisle without hurry. The folders she carried looked smaller than they had an hour ago. Not because they were less important, but because the real weight was no longer in paper. It was in what had already been said, and what couldn't be unsaid. When she reached her place, she didn't sit. She placed the folders down in a neat stack, smoothed the edge with one hand, and lifted her gaze to the room. The chair cleared her throat. "Representative Crockett," she said, "you may proceed with your closing remarks." Jasmine didn't look at her. Her eyes moved from face to face. Vance, the Democrats, the Republicans, the staffers at the periphery. She spoke without checking notes. "We've heard a lot today about power," she began. "Who has it? Who deserves it? And who's told they'll never hold it?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Every word landed with the clarity of someone who knew this was the last thing she'd say on the record today. "Some of you believe power is a chair like this one." Her hand gestured faintly to the semicircle of polished desks. "A title, a vote, a platform." She let that hang for a second, then shook her head once. "But I've seen power in a mother who won't stop writing letters, even after she's lost everything. I've seen it in a student holding a sign until her arms ache, in a doctor who saves a life and doesn't ask whether that life will ever thank him." Her eyes cut briefly to Vance, not lingering, but enough to make the connection land. "And I've seen it out there today," she continued, tilting her head toward the closed chamber doors. "In the voices of people who weren't invited into this room, but came anyway, because they understood something we forget too easily in here. Power isn't where you sit, it's who you rise for." The words didn't come with a swell of music. There were no flags waving in the background, no prearranged applause lines. Just the sentence, clean and unadorned, settling over the room like dust after a demolition. She didn't follow it with a plea. She didn't explain or soften it. She let it breathe. One senator shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another looked down at her papers, as if suddenly unsure whether to make eye contact. Jasmine gathered her folders, aligning the edges with a soft tap. Then she stepped back from the desk. She didn't bow her head or raise a fist. She simply walked toward the exit. No one clapped. No one called after her. The sound in the chamber was the sound of people realizing they just watched something that wouldn't fade when the cameras turned off. Outside, the hallway was quieter now. The crowd had thinned, but the air still carried the residue of the chants, the energy of bodies pressed close in shared purpose. As she passed through, a man in a suit nodded once. Not the perfunctory nod of politics, but the slow acknowledgement of respect. A young woman in a hoodie pulled out her phone, still recording. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she said, "We saw it. We'll remember." Jasmine didn't stop. She didn't need to. History doesn't always announce itself with parades and fireworks. Sometimes it slips into the record quietly, without ceremony. Just a single line that rewrites the rest of the page. And as the heavy doors closed behind her, the chamber felt changed, as though the marble itself had absorbed the truth she'd left behind. In the end, power was never about titles, chambers, or marble walls. It was about the quiet courage to stand where truth is needed most. Jasmine's fight was not to claim the microphone, but to prove it belongs to everyone who dares to speak for what's right. And perhaps the truest measure of any life is not how high we climb, but how many hands we reach for on the way up, because the worth of our stories is written in the lives we choose to lift. If this story made you pause, don't just move on. Hold it, pass it forward. Let it spark a conversation that's long overdue. Like, comment, and share it with someone who still believes grace should have no gatekeepers. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where every hidden truth finds its light. Hit the bell, because the next story won't be comfortable. It will challenge you, and it might just change what you think power means. This is a fictional dramatization, drawn from the shadows of real inequities and the light of real courage. Any resemblance to people or events is intentional only in spirit, to provoke reflection, not accusation. Thank you for watching. Justice doesn't arrive quietly. It's called forward. This is Harrison Stories.